Like many European cities in 2014, Bristol marked the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War, a conflict that dramatically changed the map of Europe. We know that it was the assassination of a single man, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, that started that conflict. But what exactly was he Archduke of, and why did this trigger a conflict that scarred the whole of Europe? Imagine a map of Europe. If we turn back the clock 100 years, we would still recognise many of the countries. France, Spain, Holland, Denmark, these all have more or less the same boundaries and shapes as they do today. When it comes to the southeast and centre of Europe, however, things are very different. There's one very large country which no longer exists. We refer to this in English as Austria-Hungary, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, even though that wasn't its name for most of its existence, and neither of the modern states which go by the names of Austria and Hungary covers the same territory. So let's look at that map from 100 years ago. Here is Austria-Hungary before the First World War. You'll recognise the names of some of its regions. Austria-Hungary was the product of hundreds of years of military conquests and diplomacy by its imperial rulers, the Habsburg royal family. It was said that while other dynasties fought their enemies, the Habsburgs ensured that they married their sons and daughters to other ruling families. And this is Franz Joseph I, Emperor of Austria-Hungary from 1848 to 1916, uncle of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. His official title stretched over 2 pages and named all of the territories he ruled. Franz Joseph I, by God's grace, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary and Bohemia, King of Lombardy and Venice, Dalmatia, Croatia, and so on. Where maps of this lost empire become interesting for the historian and linguist is when they represent the different language speakers and where they were at that time. Here is the language map of Austria-Hungary before the First World War. In the terms of the Habsburg bureaucracy, these language groups were referred to as Nationen or nations. The English rubric of the time calls them races. Nowadays we would say ethnic or linguistic minorities, and that in itself is an important point. Everyone in this patchwork of languages was in one sense or another in a minority. It wouldn't be too bold to suggest that this map predicts much of what follows in the 20th century if we assume that the course of that century is mapped out by conflicts over what is and is not a nation, an ethnicity, an identity. As the Yiddish linguist Max Weinreich once put it, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. Each of the groups on our map will struggle to achieve national status for their language over the following 100 years. Some of these conflicts, like that in Ukraine, part of which was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, are not over. If we look at the different groups represented on the map, we can use some examples to show what I mean. Let's take a group at the centre, the Hungarian speakers, or Magyars as they call themselves. In 1912, they represented around 20% of the population, second largest group after the German speakers. All of the Magyars were within the boundaries of the empire, and most in the half that was ruled from Budapest, and most of them were settled in a geographically discrete territory with a smaller population to the east in Transylvania, part of modern-day Romania. It should therefore come as no surprise that the Hungarian speakers achieved a political settlement, known in English as the Austro-Hungarian Compromise, by the middle of the 19th century. But the political settlement they achieved was an uncomfortable one that left them, or at least the Hungarian aristocratic landowners who represented them in the Budapest Parliament, in a territory in which they were outnumbered by Romanian, Polish, Ruthenian, that is Ukrainian, and German speakers. Other groups, who were not as numerous, didn't fare as well in their aspirations. The Polish speakers, who made up 10%, Romanian speakers, who were 6%, or the tiny minorities of Italian speakers, 2%, or Slovenes, 3%. These groups had little leverage at national level, but could dispute the use of their language locally. Some groups, for example Czech speakers, had more leverage than their numbers at 13% might suggest. The Czech speakers were all within the half of the empire ruled from Vienna, where they made up 23% of the total population and managed as a result to mount effective political campaigns for language rights within their territories. The final years of the Habsburg Empire can easily be portrayed as a series of conflicts about language and identity, in which the German-speaking Habsburgs tried against the tide of national movements to hold on to their historical legacy of a multilingual, multinational empire. But that's to suggest that there was a clear-cut Austro-Hungarian identity holding the entire patchwork together. The problem was that there wasn't. The largest of all the minorities were the German speakers, making up 24% of the total. But they were also the most scattered. Austrian German speakers had described themselves as German, Deutsch, for centuries. But since 1871, that word also meant belonging to a specific nation, to Deutschland, an empire, das Deutsche Reich. At the opposite end of the scale were the Serbian speakers, among the smallest of the many minorities in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The southeastern province of Bosnia had been joined to the empire in 1878, but only formally annexed in 1908. It contained most of Austria-Hungary's 3.8% of Serbian speakers. So in a sense, it's no surprise that the action of one Bosnian Serbian nationalist in 1914 in assassinating Franz Josef's nephew, Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the empire that vanished, started a chain of events that led to the First World War. And we shouldn't be too surprised that Hitler's annexation of the Sudetenland and then German-speaking Austria, both of which were provinces of that same Habsburg Empire, formed the prelude to the Second.